Right, that's great. Welcome to all to the April 27th, 2020 meeting of the Falls Church City Council. We're delighted that everyone is here with us virtually, and hopefully the members of the public are watching as well, but we are happy to be here doing our city's work. Madam Clerk, will you call roll, please?
Yes, sir. Ms. Conley?
Here.
Mr. Duncan?
Here.
Ms. Hardy?
Here.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Here.
Mr. Snyder?
Here.
Mr. Z?
Here.
And Mayor Tarter?
Here.
Thank you, Council.
All right, we're now going to move to the Pledge of Allegiance, and I understand we're going to have some graphics for this. And here they come, maybe. I'm going to wait for our flag to load before we get on. There we go. All right, so let's go ahead and maybe we can all say the Pledge of Allegiance. I think you may just be hearing me, but why don't we all say it in our own places. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. So let's move on now to summary of written comments. Madam Clerk, do you have some written comments for us?
I do. We received a comment from Christina New of 413. Oh, should I turn my video on? Christina New of 413 Lincoln Avenue regarding budget cuts in light of smaller revenues. Addie Rose Henderson wrote regarding pavement conditions on Madison Lane. And then we had a petition from Toomey Wen from the Eden Center requesting property tax relief for tenants of the Eden Center.
All right, thank you very much. I've got another piece of correspondence that I just received downstairs here at City Hall. I'm alone in a room, but I went and checked my mail, and I got a very nice card. I don't know if you all can see that, from Columbia Baptist Church, which says, "In these days of crisis, you are in our prayers. Blessings on your leadership. May God keep you and your family safe," which is very nice, very touching to receive. Our faith-based organizations have done so much in this time of crisis, and so we thank them all for all the great work that they do. In addition, I would also note that Ken Burnett, who is the longtime head of the Parks and Recreation Department here in Falls Church, something for maybe 36 or 37 years, recently passed away. And some of you, maybe all of you, recall that we've actually named the rec center after him. And so he just passed, I think, over this past weekend. And so in honor of him, but all of the people who are suffering now through death from coronavirus, for economic hardship, for all the first responders and police and medical staff who are on the front lines, why don't we start tonight's meeting with a moment of silence, if we may. All right, thank you all. So why don't we move on to the first item of business on the agenda. Madam Clerk, will you call that item?
Yes, and I also would like to ask the city attorney if we needed to say a statement about how we're conducting the meeting.
I don't know that we need to, but I can go ahead. I can give a statement about the laws that have been governing the emergency meetings and this meeting, including the recent legislation.
That would be great, yes. We know that there's been new legislation. The public may not be fully aware of that, so maybe if you could give an update to all of us, that would be great.
Yes. As part of the budget bills that were recently adopted by the Virginia General Assembly, legislation to allow more virtual meetings during a declared emergency in the Commonwealth was passed. Now, before this legislation and in our last couple of meetings, if the governor had declared a state of emergency, public bodies could hold virtual meetings without a quorum physically present in the room, the types of meetings that we're having here, only for two purposes. One would be to directly address the emergency. That would the Attorney General characterized that as where immediate action is necessary and the consequences of the council's failure to act would be irrevocable, or where the action is required to ensure the continuity of government. So that's what was allowed in the past. That's what we've been doing for our last couple of meetings. But as the COVID-19 pandemic has continued and it remains unsafe for public entities to gather in one room and include the public, additional solutions were sought. So as part of the budget bills, one goes from now until the end of this fiscal year, June 30th, and one that will begin the following fiscal year. Amendments were adopted that give the public bodies in the Commonwealth more flexibility. So the amendments to the budget bill allow public entities during a declared state of emergency to hold virtual meetings without a quorum physically present, where the purpose is to transact business statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of the public body, and for the discharge of council's lawful purposes, duties, and responsibility. So this authority will allow council to do most of its business in an ongoing basis in virtual meetings, so long as a declared emergency lasts. It also includes some additional requirements that will ensure adequate public access to meetings and transparency, including additional requirements for notices of meetings, the posting of minutes, posting of recordings or transcripts of meetings, and opportunities for public comment. The city will be allowing those opportunities as much as it is able to do so with the available technology. Council will still need to approach some items such as proclamations and general statements with some restraint, and we'll consider those as the need arises. But, and we just need to remember that these virtual meetings are allowed as an exception to the FOIA requirements, and the restrictions on them should be carefully observed. So tonight we have a couple of items, including an easement and a contract item, which will be allowed because of this amendment that was signed by the governor on Friday. So we are continuing with virtual meetings, which have some limits, but we have much more flexibility at this time.
Thank you, Ms. City Attorney. And just to clarify, does this legislation also apply to boards and commissions so that our boards and commissions can begin their important work as well?
It does. It includes boards, commissions, authorities, and regional entities, which were not ever included in any of the earlier authority, but groups like NVRC, PRTC will be able to act at virtual meetings under this new law.
Okay, that's great news, I think, for the city.
Commissions.
Mr. Mayor, I have a question.
Sure, and before you get to that, I just want to remind myself that the Falls Church Education Foundation just also sent us a letter earlier today and discussing some of their great work. And before we get on to the actual business on the agenda, I do want to make note of that, and maybe the Vice Mayor would also like to comment on that. But go ahead right now with your question, Vice Mayor Conley.
My question is just regarding our boards and commissions. It's great that the governor has approved the ability for them to meet, and I know that's going to take a large staff effort to make that happen. So I'm just wondering if there's been thought from people on staff of how that's going to work, because I know how much work it takes just to set up this kind of meeting for us to meet the 7 city council members, and we have a lot of boards and commissions and a lot of board and commission meetings. So how will that? Are there any plans as to how that's going to work? I'm not sure if Mr. Shields or Ms. Heath can answer that question, or Ms. Mustard.
I guess, is that me?
I'm going to defer to Ms. Heath. Yes, thank you.
Okay, yes. Yes, we have been working with a staff committee and we've been planning for boards and commissions to start meeting like this for over a month now. So we have a plan to use Skype to allow public access. We've vetted that legally for public access. We're going to be adding some call-in features to that IT is working on, and we're hopefully we'll get that going before we start having our board and commission meetings. We're prioritizing getting council regular business on your agenda first, which we started doing tonight. We've added a few items. Secondly, getting the planning commission meeting again. They'll meet in a similar fashion as you do. And then the third priority is starting to get our boards and commissions that legally need to meet, and also those that are advising the council and the planning commission on issues that you guys are trying to move forward. So those are our three top priorities, and we're going to start. We actually are going to have a sort of test of it tomorrow night. The EDC is meeting under another chapter of FOIA. They had set up a meeting for an emergency item before all of this new regulation came down. So we'll be testing that out, and public will have access through Skype. They'll be able to attend the meeting and listen to it. So we do have plans in place, and we'll be sending some information out to our board and commission volunteers this week.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions about the recent legislation regarding electronic meetings? Okay, if not, I did want to mention, make note of the Falls Church Education Foundation's recent, really extraordinary efforts. I believe they've raised, if recollection serves, $100,000 just in these past several weeks. They're distributing them to family, staff of the schools, families. I believe over 250 families are being served. So it's a really extraordinary effort, as there are many others here in the city. But Vice Mayor Connolly, did you have anything, additional information you wanted to share about their efforts?
I just wanted to highlight that in the letter that Debbie Hiscott, the executive director of the Education Foundation, sent to us earlier today, I guess it was an email, she started out by thanking the amazing community for the incredible support, because all the money that has been raised to go into this fund that the Education Foundation is able to help disperse has come from members of the community. And she said they've received donations for as little as $10 all the way up to $12,000. And so many members of the community are participating and supporting other members of the community. And I just think that's an amazing testament to our community. So thanks to community members. Thank you for the Education Foundation for your support in stewarding all these funds and making sure that people are taken care of. And she also mentions that 100% of the funds are going to support the community, and the needs of the program have increased by 8% just in the past week. So I think those needs are going to keep increasing. But thank you so much to everyone for doing that.
All right, thank you. And unless there's any other preliminary business, why don't we go on to the business on the agenda, Madam Clerk?
Yes, sir. Answering emails and doing this at the same time. First on our agenda is a first reading of TO 20-05, ordinance fixing and determining the budget of expenditures and revenues and appropriating funds for the fiscal year 2021 general fund, school operating fund, school community service fund, school food service fund, cable access fund, sewer fund, and stormwater fund.
All right, thank you very much. I think we got all the funds there. So, Mr. Shields, did you want to start this presentation or have anything as a preliminary?
Mr. Mayor, do you have something to read?
No, I don't. Let me see if I do. I'm not sure if my packet includes the disclosure, and I'm not seeing it right here. So maybe if you've got one in front of you, you can read it, and I can second it as to myself.
I'll put yours down.
Okay, thank you.
I make the following statement before City Council's consideration.
Mary Beth, we lost your audio.
Oh. Let me try again. I make the following statement before City Council's consideration of TO 20-05 and TO 20-07, the FY 2021 general fund budget and tax rates. I am an employee of the Falls Church City School Board, and therefore I'm a member of a group of 3 or more persons who may be affected by these matters. I can participate in this matter fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
All right. Well, I tell you, I do not have the actual language in front of me, although what I'm going to do right now, at least until I receive the actual text of the disclosure, and it looks like it's hot off the presses and it's worked its way right here, right now. All right, there we go. So I've got mine right now. I make the following statement before City Council's consideration of TO 20-05 and TO 2007, the general fund budget and tax rates for fiscal year 2021. My wife is an employee of the Falls Church City School Board, and therefore I'm a member of a group of 3 or more persons who may be affected by the FY 2021 budget. I can participate in this matter fairly, objectively, and in the public interest. All right, those are behind us. Mr. Shields, do you have anything you want to start the conversation with?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. I do. And I also have a PowerPoint presentation just to summarize the proposed budget that's before council tonight for first reading. Before I go into those slides, if I could just note that during the manager's report later in the agenda, I will provide a report on the work that many of us are doing together to both provide input to, but also follow Governor Northam's announcements and initial planning on our reopening process and the work that we're doing to try to make sure that that's coordinated for the national capital region, including Maryland and DC. And secondly, in the manager's report, Mike Whitfield is with us to provide an update on our progress on carrying out capital improvements in the city. And I just note that at the outset because I think all these things are tied together with our budget. So to discuss the budget, just by way of introduction, obviously it's a completely different day today than it was on March 9th when the FY21 budget was first presented to the City Council by me and by the chairman of the school board, Greg Anderson, and our superintendent of schools, Peter Noonan. If you recall, the next week on March 16th is when we declared a state of emergency for the COVID-19 public health emergency. So what you'll see tonight is our proposed operating budget. We asked for first reading of it tonight. We'll have discussion of it through council meetings over the coming month and a request for adoption at your meeting on May 26th. The capital improvements program we ask be on a separate track, and that be given first reading on May 26th and adoption on June 22nd. The CIP still has some pieces to it where we're still gathering information related to the current emergency and funding streams. That is the reason for the dual tracks on those 2 aspects of our budget. Before I go through our slides also, I think I need to pause and give a lot of thanks. Thanks to many people. But I'll start with thanks to Superintendent Noonan and the school board and Kristen Michael. They've been, Kieran Bawa has put our entire budget together with our department directors. And this has been a lot of really hard work, and I would characterize it as emergency work because we've had to move very quickly to both revise our forecasts and then adapt to them. But so many people have worked really quickly, and I think in good teamwork and good spirit in light of the crisis. And I think we're all mindful of the fact that the tough budgets we'll be wrestling with, they really are a reflection of the really high levels of suffering that our business community and our residents are encountering, for those who might be out of work, for those whose businesses are shut down. And so as we're putting together what we believe is a responsible budget, we're very mindful of the extreme contraction to the economy that's happening right now, the record unemployment that's happening in our society right now. Across the country, states and local governments are dealing with the fiscal crisis, which is the fallout from the public health crisis. And so again, I think this should properly be viewed as an emergency budget. In our budgeting approach, we have taken, Ms. Bawa presented to the City Council earlier in April a range of scenarios, and we chose to build a budget on a moderate scenario in terms of the contraction, relatively speaking. But we all need to be mindful of the fact that worse scenarios are not unlikely. Worse scenarios, in fact, could very well occur. And so I think we should also view this as a set of responsible decisions right now that we will need to revisit in the fall, and we'll also keep the community and the City Council up to date on in terms of our revised revenue forecasts on a regular and monthly basis so that everyone is aware of the situation as it unfolds over the coming days, over the coming months. I will also say that it's not all doom and gloom. In this period of time, a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation has happened. We've heard about it, throughout our city, and it's certainly true with our school administration, and it's certainly true with our general government administration. So we've really, I think, risen to this challenge, but we know it's going to be with us for a long time as well. So starting with the first slide, Cindy, if you could advance to that.
Mr. City Manager?
Yes.
May I just let the public know that if they have any comments about the budget they'd like to share with council, they can send them to cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov to email, and we will read them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this first slide has a series of our revised revenue estimates and the changes to the operating budget. So our total revenues as compared to the current budget, FY20, is a 2.3% reduction of operating revenues. We do have the planned use of reserves to help pay for the debt service for the high school, which was always part of our plan of finance, so we're sticking with that. With respect to the expenditure side, the school transfer will have a $500,000 decrease, or 1.2% decrease. The general government will have a 5% reduction relative to FY20, or just over a $2 million reduction. And we'll go into a little bit of detail on the WMATA picture. Our debt service is a known quantity. It's unchanged from the March 9th budget presentation with a 9.3 or $1.249 million increase. The pension return on investment is something we always show during budget time, just to record the benefit of the council's investment and the benefit that accrues to our taxpayers with that investment that was made about 3 years ago with a portion of the water sale proceeds. Next slide. While we're going to the next slide, I'll just note that relative to the budget that was presented on March 9th, the decrease in spending overall is 5.6 million, or a negative 5.4% relative to the March 9th presentation. And we'll go through all the ways that gap was closed. This slide shows a summary of the reductions in the revenue forecast. And starting with real estate, because our assessments are made effective January 1, the 4% increase in assessed value is actually unchanged. The data that we have so far indicates that that's probably still accurate in the residential component of our real estate assessed value. The commercial portion of our assessed value, of course, is where the great difficulties are, with all of our restaurants and other businesses needing to close in response to the executive orders from the governor. And that will undoubtedly have significant impact on our commercial real estate evaluations. But more to see on that in the coming months. We're revising down personal property tax, sales taxes, meals taxes, and business licenses and other taxes by the amounts shown. Sales tax is a more modest downturn, partly because our 2020 numbers so greatly already exceeded our budget in the area of sales tax. But we need to watch that very carefully as those numbers come in on a monthly basis, and we'll start to see the effect of the current crisis coming in July, when we'll start to see the returns for March and April. Next slide. So this is a kind of a snapshot of the decreases that are budgeted, with the largest decreases in the meals tax, business licenses, and hotel taxes. The charges for services are decreasing, and a lot of that is our rec and park department. That's where those reductions are. And then with the declining interest rates, our investment and rent is declining as well. Next slide. So in terms of closing the shortfall, there are two components to it. One is the revenue shortfall of 1.36 million, which is shown on slide 2. But in addition, we have mandated increases to our partners that we contract services with, whether they be Arlington County, Fairfax County, WMATA being sort of the big three. We have $1 million of mandated increases in those areas. And that causes us to have a shortfall that we needed to close in a very short period of time, essentially about 10 days of work to close a $2.36 million shortfall. Next slide. So the next couple of slides will show where that is. First, here's a slide on the WMATA subsidy. That is decreased from the March 9th budget presentation, and we think this is actually now a final number, and we'll be using our NVTA 30% funds to cover our WMATA subsidy this year. Next slide. Okay. So some of the ways that we're balancing the budget relative to the March 9th budget presentation, that budget did have employee pay increases and also had new positions. All of those are eliminated in the budget that's being presented to you now. The transfer for the school board is a decrease of $500,000 relative to FY20. We are freezing all general government vacancies. There are currently about 18 positions that are vacant. That includes part-time positions plus full-time positions. And if we freeze those through December, that's $710,000 of budget reduction. We're reducing the pay-as-you-go funding for capital projects. That includes the investment in city facilities by $175,000. Again, now these are compared to the FY20 numbers. So the neighborhood traffic calming, which was budgeted in FY20 at $100,000, that would be held in abeyance or suspended. And the spot improvements for sidewalks, also $100,000. The strategy for these would be, again, to reassess in October about the status of the economy and revisit these decisions across the board in terms of where we are, whether revenues are increasing, in which case we can add funding back, or decreasing, in which case we need to make further reductions. Next slide, Cindy. In the March 9th budget, there were $160,000 of savings occurring due to the performance of our retirement system. That's still in the budget. We do our actuarial report every June, and so next year's, with the decline in the stock market and our portfolio value, we may have a different picture for our retirement fund. $200,000 from reduced recreation programs, and those are actually related to the COVID emergency, where we've had to cancel those programs, but they also that cuts our revenues, but it also, this is the cost side that we're cutting as well. Freezing travel, training, and professional development for a workforce, that's $93,000. Our jail costs are actually revising those down based on our current trends. That's $87,000. And I asked all of our department heads to go back through their budgets to identify additional reductions. And these are in the areas of repairs and maintenance or purchase of equipment, supplies, salaries for temporary personnel, and that accounts for $228,000 of budget reductions. Next slide. So there are some of the things that are still in the budget. We had a number of things that were just revenue neutral or cost neutral, and those are kept in. So those include having a police officer for traffic enforcement and the emergency management coordinator. That was a reassignment. Also, the moving from having dedicated crossing guards to having public safety aid positions, taking a larger number of crossing guard positions and concentrating them into 3 FTEs that will do parking enforcement, work special events, as well as be crossing guards. And then we do still have a lot of construction happening in the city, and so we're keeping in the budget the 2 existing FTEs using the building permit reserve. So that's still in the budget. Next slide. In the March 9th budget, we had an increase in funding for rent relief for seniors and persons with disability. That remains in the budget. We also had a plus up for rental assistance. We've kept that in the budget. On the positive side, we've been awarded $39,000 for emergency rental assistance. That will be a future budget amendment because it's a grant award that we have not yet received, but as soon as we do, we'll probably have that as an add-in to the budget. The General Assembly, in its initial budget, had a $2 million grant for the City of Falls Church. The state is in its own fiscal emergency right now, and this $2 million, along with about $1 billion of other state spending, has put into a kind of a reserve fund, and the General Assembly will make decisions on it, we're told, in August. So that is on hold. Next slide. The library board had an initiative to eliminate library fines for overdue books and materials. We've kept that in the budget. That had about a $35,000 cost associated with it. We've also kept the downtown improvements in the budget at the level of $62,000, and that's a program using the hotel tax, a portion of the hotel tax, to sustain downtown improvements. So we have kept that in the budget. Next slide. With respect to the stormwater fund, the main message here is that we would propose to consider the rate changes in the future after the economy recovers. We will revisit it again in the fall in terms of the ability of our community to take on the increase in rates that were required to finance the approximately $14 million for the major flood mitigation projects that were identified and prioritized by the Stormwater Task Force. That is the recommendation that's in this budget, and we look forward to community input and the council's ultimate decision on that. But that's what we would propose. What this would mean is the council would, when you get the CIP on May 26th, that the full suite of the Stormwater Task Force major projects would be in the CIP for your consideration and action, but they do require a separate action to issue debt for those, and we would anticipate that that would not occur until the economy recovers. So the CIP will show the projects, but action would not proceed on them until that later council action. Next slide. I'm sorry, one last important point on the stormwater side. The council will recall that we had some smaller projects that were to be paid for with existing stormwater funds. those are advancing, and our intention is to accomplish those projects as soon as they can be done with the funds that are available. And so those are some of the smaller projects that were identified in the immediate aftermath of the flooding last summer. Next slide. For the sanitary sewer fund, on March 9th, I proposed a rate increase. We haven't had one for 2016, and we do have some needs going forward on the capital improvements program, which will be largely paid for out of developer fees. So we will proceed with the planning for those capacity purchases, but the underlying rate change, which really is there to cover debt service and operating costs, we would come to council for that next year in FY 2022. Again, presumably we'll have a clearer picture of the economy at that time. Next slide. So the schedule, what's before you is an ordinance for first reading for the FY 2021, which I've just summarized. In addition, first reading on the tax rate ordinance. The tax rate ordinance has no changes to the rates that are currently in effect. We would have a public hearing on May 11th, and the council would have second reading and final consideration for the operating budget on May 26th. Again, we would have a consideration of the capital improvements program for first reading, then on May 26th, and second reading on June 22nd. So with that, again, let me thank Kieran Bawa and Melissa Ryman for all of their work to put this budget together with our department heads, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, thank you, Mr. Shields. Before we open it up to questions and comments, I would like to give the public an opportunity to participate in this discussion. So, Madam Clerk, could you read out that email address again?
Sure. It is cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov, and that's VA like Virginia. And we do actually have one comment on the budget at this point.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, go ahead and read that, and if any others come in during the course of the meeting, maybe you could indicate at some point that you've got additional comments.
Okay. You'd like me to read that one now?
Yes.
Okay. We have Elise Wilson wrote, she stated the water department was sold for $40+ million, and she's curious where the money went. If it was being saved for an emergency, wouldn't this be an emergency?
All right. Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Shields, if you want to do a brief summary of the proceeds from the water sale for the benefit of the citizen very quickly.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's two. So first, with respect to the water sale proceeds, those funds have been put into the capital reserve, and so they are all committed aspects of our fund balance, and they're an intrinsic part of our plan of finance for the high school in particular. But to expand upon the question, the city also has unassigned fund balance. And it is not the city's practice, and it wouldn't be my recommendation to budget for unassigned fund balance to cover operating expenses. Where the unassigned fund balance does come into play is in a rapidly developing fiscal crisis where the city does not have enough time to react to make the adjustments to spending. That's the time when unassigned fund balance is used, in our history and I think in local governments across the country. So it would not be my recommendation, and it's not the recommendation in this proposed budget, to use unassigned fund balance to cover our operating costs. In this budget, however, there is the use of the water sale proceeds as part of our capital plan of finance to use those to help cover the increase in debt service for the high school. But that was planned. That's been part of our plan of finance for the high school for over 3 years. And so we're simply keeping with their plan in that respect.
All right, thank you. I'd also make note that a portion of this money from the water sale proceeds also went into our pension plan, which has delivered, sizable returns each year. And you may note that earlier also in your presentation. So was there a question from someone on council? I thought I'd heard from someone. Let's go ahead and move to questions and comments from council, if we could. Does anyone on council have any questions or comments for Mr. Shields or Ms. Bawa?
Mayor, I do.
All right, is that Letty Hardy?
Yeah. How'd you guess?
Yeah, that's right. All right, go ahead.
So Ms. Bawa, the April 20th date stuck out to me because I remember from our earlier conversations that was the important date when we were going to get our first piece of data on how March, I think it's meals and hotel taxes were coming in. So now that we're a week past, do you have any updates on how the last 2 weeks of March looked for our businesses and whether that's in line with that moderate scenario that we were basing this budget on, or more, or worse, or better?
So if I would like to recall here that we brought to council an emergency ordinance providing a temporary suspension on the payment relief for timing for meals and transient occupancy tax. So now they're due on June 1st. So all these projections are more in line with what we are seeing and what I'm hearing from other economists and other forecasts for the region, and of course seeing what we have done in the past, however, absent any actual data to date.
Okay, so no one turned their taxes in anyway?
No.
Okay. And then while I've got you, I know that we're assuming that real estate assessments stay as is for FY21, but usually, I think as we saw with the last recession, there's usually a lag. Do we have any regional thoughts on what FY22 impacts might be, and how do we need to start thinking about that now? Because obviously that's a much bigger portion of our budget.
That's correct. So I am working with the city's assessor on getting some idea. However, again, the timing is of the essence here, and we have prolonged that by another 31 days. So on any collections, I would not know as of yet. However, for assessment values for the following year, for assessments as of January 1st, 2021, the housing market seems to have held up so far, and it's the commercial piece that we are concerned about going forward.
Okay. I think as we get more data, that would be helpful to know whether we might need to prepare for more of the worst case, especially since real estate values assessments are 60% of our tax base.
Absolutely, and I'd like to say that since we are doing this budget to meet all the timelines for budget adoption, we will be coming back to council in the early part of next fiscal year when we have some significant, or at least some data trends and some actual data that we can base our trends on. And if we require any adjustment upwards or downwards, we will be coming back to council as part of the first quarter report sometime in fall, November timeframe.
Okay, thank you. And then I have more specific questions. Mr. Shields, how much have we spent on COVID-19 related direct costs? So whether it's PPE for city staff, emergency pay, the communications we've done, and then what's our best guess on how much of that and then some will we get covered at the state level?
So we have tallied up about $50,000 worth of direct costs for the city's response to the COVID-19 emergency. I think we'll be reimbursed for every penny of that. The difficulty is that the city's fiscal hit is much more significant than our direct outlays. And so there's a big gap between the Treasury's guidance on the use of federal CARES dollars and how local governments can actually spend the money. Our congressional delegation is aware of that, but there has not been a solution as of yet.
Have we seen increased costs for our share of the health department resources, or increases in food programs or rental assistance? Do we call that direct cost related to the pandemic?
let me, before I answer that question, let me look into it in detail. We're working really hard on that aspect of it, and we have a team that works with our finance department just to make sure that we are properly coding all costs associated with our direct response. And so let me get a fuller report to your question once I've got all the facts.
Great. Yeah, 50 just seemed low, and I just want to make sure that we're, number one, reimbursed at the minimum amount, and then we can get more to help on the revenue side too.
Yes, we agree.
Great.
Ms. Hardy, I just if I could interject, I've been on a few calls that relate to this issue, and the problem I think lies with very restrictive guidance from the Treasury Department, which in turn flows down to the state. And so I think the state is sympathetic, and maybe some people at the federal government are sympathetic, but the rules are fairly or are tightly written. And so it doesn't give much latitude to interpretation as to what can be included other than a fairly limited amount of discrete items. And so I think the hope is in later bills, the so-called fourth stimulus package may include more broad and direct aid to localities that seeks to replace lost revenue as opposed to a tightly defined additional cost relating to the pandemic, if that makes any sense.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for all the advocacy you're doing on behalf of the city. I know it's definitely a hard effort. On that note, on kind of new needs, Mr. Shields, are we hearing of increased demand for people seeking rent relief or emergency funds of any kind? And is the demand that we're hearing bigger than what you're proposing in the budget, even with the CDBG dollars you're expecting to get?
We are. The CDBG dollars are certainly going to help, but there is a constant stream of phone calls into the city's emergency number for people who are seeking relief on a whole host of fronts. And so is this enough? I don't think I can say that it is, but we're working within the kind of the constraints that we have. I think that those relief numbers are a constrained number, not a demand-driven number.
Got it. And so I guess my request, at least before we finalize this budget, is I'd like to know how big the demand is, how big that gap is. So I'm not comfortable saying, well, we're just going to fund what we can, because I think, frankly, the need is greater. And I think there's just basic human needs that I think local government needs to meet. So I'd at least like to know how big the gap is and then what we can do to get closer to that demand. And then moving on to NTC. So with removal of the $100,000 in this revised budget, I thought we were funding NTC at $200,000 every year in the operating budget. Does that mean we're still leaving 100, or it would be at zero?
So that's compared to the 2020 budget, and we had $100,000 in 2020 that was coupled with the $640,000 grant. So what this budget proposes is to hold back any of the $100,000 that and hold that until October, when we'll reassess our spending plan.
And this assumes we still get that $600,000 federal grant, or is that in limbo now?
No, that is, there's no indication that money is in jeopardy.
Okay. So what would be left? I guess, do we have anything carried over from FY20 right now in NTC?
We do. So the council appropriated $400,000, and we also have money left over from the Gundry and Annandale project. So what we've communicated currently with the projects that were immediately in that conceptual design phase is that we're still working with the communities on those conceptual designs. We're getting their input on them, and we have communicated to them our current fiscal issues, and communicated to them that the spending plan will be reconsidered by the City Council with decisions in May. So that's what we've communicated to the public on the NTC projects that we're working on right now.
I assume most people will be very understanding, but I think what would be helpful for that conversation is to put it in terms of real projects. So assuming the budget passes with no new funding for NTC, what does that realistically mean? It means, X, Y, and Z projects don't get done until the next budget cycle potentially, or later if the economic conditions don't improve. Is that what I'm hearing? That kind of, okay.
Yes, that's correct.
I remember as part of the surplus that we allocated in the February vote, there was money that was going to go towards traffic calming. Is that all programmed and assigned to the various projects, or is there?
And so that when I was referring to the communication we're having with our neighborhoods on the projects that were in the queue to be addressed with that 400,000, that's the communication we've made to them. So that money is being held, as well as the $100,000 reduction in FY21. Now, I know going through this budget process, the council will have its views and ultimately make its decision with respect to the disposition of funds. But at the present time, my direction to staff is to not spend those dollars.
Okay. So could we get a breakdown of, I guess it was like a $4.6 million surplus, a breakdown of what's being spent out of there and what's on hold?
Yes, we can provide that to you.
Okay. And then last question, I'll hand it over. I think it might have been the city manager's, not the deck, but the written letter, it talked about the WMATA costs and then something about the 3T. And I think there was a double negative in there, so I was confused. But I think I understood it as the WMATA amount that we have to pay does not include the reduction of the 3T service. Is that correct? So even though the 3T is going to go away by the end of the year, we're still paying for it? Is that how I'm interpreting it?
If I could defer the response to that to Cindy Mester.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Shields. As it relates to the 3T, we have grant funding through December 2020, and so that is in the WMATA budget. And then nothing after that. It's not in the city's base budget because it's grant funded. Part of the reason the overall WMATA dollar amount has come down since the March 9th proposed budget is some changes in negotiating on the overall 21 budget, but we were also able to properly account for the 3T, so it's not in our base budget and not in the 3% increase. And so that's where it got a little confusing. It could sound like a double negative. So it is in the budget through the end of December, and then it's out of the WMATA budget and not a city impact. There are some separate issues we're working with WMATA on in terms of how federal funding can help offset WMATA overall liabilities and what grant funds could be used related to 3T. Because of COVID-19, the 3T as well as many of the bus routes are not actually operating right now. They're not running, providing service.
My related question is, as Metro is not running and obviously not spending as much, is our share actually going down any, or if we're still expected to play this flat costs?
Their costs are actually not going down. It's very nominal because all of the employees are still, and cleaning of buses that are running, or which is a little higher, is still operating. So they've been awarded federal relief, CARES Act related to transit, and so we're working with them on how that gets applied to their fare reductions and the local government's subsidy commitments. But their actual operating costs are not going down, so we're trying to use the federal money to offset our financial liability to still provide that operating subsidy.
Got it. Well, that's unfortunate that is not going down. I lied, Mayor. I actually have two more questions.
Go for it.
On deferring stormwater. So while I agree with the proposal to hold off on that, I think my concern is obviously it'll keep raining and we're going to keep flooding, especially with climate change. So do we need to plan on the operating side any more short-term response teams or any work to kind of prepare the fact that we're not going to be able to take on the bigger capital project for at least a year?
I think that's a good question. We do have Mike Whitfield on this call or in this meeting, and I'd welcome him to respond. I'll also note, just as an example, we are looking very carefully at the weather this week. We're going to have a lot of moisture all week, and Wednesday night in particular, there's the potential, Wednesday and Thursday, the potential for flooding. So we will, as we've been doing regularly, is trying to help our property owners protect themselves when we know that there's a flooding event coming. But Mike, do you have anything you would add to that in terms of how we can, how we're using our operating budget to mitigate against flooding?
Yes. So good evening. We do have quite a few little things that we have in our program, and in operating budget specifically, we have decided to take these crews and assign them to stormwater specific projects. And so these projects are a way to lower some of the cost due to budget constraints right now. And so what we're going to start with is we're actually going to start with some of these little small projects. These are some that actually came out of the stormwater task force, and those will start sometime this summer. The two crews will just assign permanently to those until we can get some of these things accomplished. Those are going to be minor. And so some of the things that we might be able to explore, and I've already talked with our superintendent, Robert Goff, about this, is it's probably going to be more cost effective for us to assign two crews and do some of these smaller projects, use some of those funds that are available for material and even equipment rental rather than contract these out. And I'll cover some of the other stormwater projects here in this presentation coming up.
That's good here, because I think for both traffic calming and stormwater, which I think we've heard is really the top two citizen requests in the past 18 months or so, to the extent that we can get creative with cost-effective solutions to give people near-term relief, I think will be important, because it sounds like we're deferring a lot of these bigger, expensive things for later.
That's right.
Then last question. So it kind of relates actually to the topic at the beginning of the meeting on virtual meetings and making sure we're prepared. So given that it seems like we're probably going to be in virtual mode for the foreseeable future and may not be returning to real meetings, I want to make sure that in this budget, we're also comfortable with how much resources or technology we need to get to ramp that up so that we actually can be nimble and have the city's business go on as usual. So Mr. Shields, do you feel comfortable that we have the right IT investment or people we need? Because this is definitely a muscle that we probably will need to build if we're not already there.
So we had to cut the IT budget along with all the other departments. They weren't immune to this. And so these budget reductions do not help us in terms of the expenditures we need to make in the realm of technology. So I think our eyes should be open to that. I could, as a follow-up, I could list, I'd be happy to list in more detail the cuts we did make to IT, just so the council is aware of those.
I think that would be helpful. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of like the human services response. I think a consequence of us having to go virtual means we're going to have to do more in other places. And so if we need some upgrade to Skype in order to make these meetings happen, or allow our boards and commissions to meet more easily, I think that's something that I'd at least like to know what the cost is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that is an emergency expenditure, or at any rate, I think we can make the case that those are emergency expenditures as a direct result of this crisis. And we'll look into that as an avenue for funding, not just for IT equipment, but other equipment that the city needs to respond properly.
Great. Okay, I'm done now.
All right, thank you very much. Looks like Mr. Lichtenhouse has got some questions. Mr. Lichtenhouse, and by the way, before you get started, Madam Clerk, can you read that email periodically so folks who want to comment will have an opportunity to do so during this meeting, and maybe even for next meeting, get it a banner across the bottom of the screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, maybe you could read the email address one more time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. It's cityclerk, fallschurchva.gov.
All right, thank you very much. And I will remind everyone to keep their computers on mute if you're not speaking, but it's Mr. Lichtenhouse's turn. Go ahead, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just want to start off by thanking Greg Anderson, Peter Noonan, school board, school staff for the letter that they sent and also their willingness to share in some of the pain with the downturn. Legally, they don't have to do that. And frankly, there's nothing in past precedent that would compel them to do that other than just shouldering that that pain that we're all experiencing on the city and frankly as a community. And I want to thank them for doing that. $500,000 is something that they didn't have to do. Certainly appreciate it. I know from my standpoint, early on, being on council, one of my primary objectives was working towards a rev share agreement with our Budget and Finance Committee, and we were finally able to do that, even though it wasn't formally papered. But in the spirit of that, they have shown a willingness to shoulder this burden with us. So I want to thank them for that publicly, for walking that line with us. In terms of the comment related to the WMATA budget, I don't know if there's anything we can do about this, but frankly, I find it infuriating, but also laughable that our WMATA share wouldn't go down if buses and transit aren't moving and ridership is down. I would hope that they could manage their own business and operating expenses would decrease and potentially lower the burden on surrounding jurisdictions. So maybe it's just a soapbox complaint, but if there's anything else that we can do and we can continue to push, I think it's ridiculous that we couldn't get our allocation down. I do want to comment similarly on neighborhood traffic calming as well as some of the other PAYGO capital projects. I'm opposed to the idea that we cut those out of the budget for 21. I think that that's a common pitfall that folks have a tendency to fall into when things get bad. We start to cut out the things that seem small but are investments in both the improvement of the business, call it the city. And those are small amounts. I feel like we could find a way to come up with $375,000. We've just spent an enormous amount of money approving both the renovation and construction of new city facilities, and the idea that we would cut out $175,000 in city facility maintenance, to me, I think is a bit short-sighted, as well as the $200,000 taken out of traffic calming and spot improvements. As Ms. Hardy said, both stormwater and traffic calming seem to dominate the agenda for the last 6 to 12 months. And the idea that we're going to put some of that on hold for at least a year, probably two, at least anything above and beyond what has been our really low benchmark and baseline, I think is also short-sighted. So I'd like to see those back in the budget before we get to final approval and second reading. We just burned through $4 million in surplus, and now we're starting to cut out things that people have been specifically asking for the last year plus. And again, I think it's very short-sighted for us to remove those. Those are the types of projects where little dollars, little amounts can actually go a long way. And for us to remove those from the budget, again, I think is very, very short-sighted, especially because they're all public safety related. And then the last comment I'll make, and I know that we're working off kind of a moderate case scenario here. I'm a little concerned that our year-over-year decrease in meals tax of approximately 20% is probably way off the mark. It seems that most of the businesses that I've talked to in town who are generating those meals taxes, their business is down to a third of what it was. I don't frankly expect there to be a pre-COVID-19 rebound over the next year. There will obviously be an improvement. So I'm a little concerned that that number may not be as bad as it possible. What we're expecting it to be as possible, as bad as it will be. So those are my comments, questions, as well as requests. Again, when it comes to the things that I'd like to see back in the budget, I feel like we can get skinny in some other places to be able to put that back in. But I don't want our public safety and the requests from the voters who, frankly, elected us into these positions and are the original stewards of the taxpayer money not to get what folks have been begging for, and those are little dollars in the grand scheme of things. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Other comments or questions about the budget?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Duncan, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to Mr. Shields, Ms. Bawa, and the folks over on the school board side for putting together a budget that none of us like, and all of us understand why they had to do what they had to do. Not sure in October whether things will be better or worse, but a lot of what we're talking about here now probably will be changed in October. So with that in mind, I'll try to keep my time brief. I do want to second the notion that we have a little more discussion about resources allocated for neighborhood traffic calming, spot improvements, and stormwater. I feel like if I had a list in front of me of all the, as Mr. Whitfield put it, the small projects that we're finding a way to work on, that more would be happening than maybe I'm aware. And I would just like us to have a good understanding 2 weeks from now of what we can realistically accomplish between now and October if we had, somewhat more resources. After October, things in that area all sort of get quiet, and it's not until next spring that a whole lot happens. So I would just second what Mr. Litkenhouse and Ms. Hardy said about a better understanding of what we can accomplish in those areas. The other one that I would add that I've mentioned before is, are there any costs associated or effort that needs to be expended in connection with the November election? Anything that we're going to do differently because of the constraints of social distancing, more equipment or staff for the poll workers, vote by mail expenses? I don't know, but it's an area that I don't want to wait until October to talk about. Whatever we're going to do obviously needs to be done by then. So I would like a little better understanding of what the budget has in mind for that, if anything. Maybe the answer is we don't have anything in mind, and there we go. But I would like to know that by 2 weeks from now if we could. My higher level question, I guess, is, so if I'm looking at the manager's PowerPoint or his memo, which is a very fine memo, on page 4, there's about $2.5 million that we're dealing with here, cutting back on 2.4, 2.6, somewhere around in that area. 2 million of that comes from the general government side. 500,000 comes from the school side. So to somebody who asks me the question, if you all are sharing the pain here, why is it that the pain on general government is 2 million and the pain on schools is $500,000? What's the short answer to that question? Does it have to do with the amount of personnel on the school side as opposed to general government? Are they handling positions and compensation differently than you plan to on general government? What's the answer to the question I've just posed?
Let me give a short answer, and Ms. Bawa might be able to jump in with some additional information. 2 big considerations. One, the school board also has to wrestle with what is anticipated to be decreases in state funding and sales tax receipts that will cut their overall budget. And so those numbers weren't known at the time that we were sharing our information with the school administration, but we knew likely that they were going to be bad. So that's one part of the story that's not yet visible in terms of the school's budget. Then the other aspect of it was the how we would go about making the reductions. And the school budget is more constrained than the general government from the simple metric that over 80% of the school budget is personnel, whereas about 55% of the general government budget is personnel. And so in terms of immediate actions that we can take to reduce expenditures, the general government has more flexibility than the school budget does. Those are 2 quick answers to your question.
Okay. Are they, and you're discussing, normally when we'd have a first reading on a budget, of course, they'd be here and they'd be able to answer for themselves. So I'm going to have to ask you to answer for them.
Mr. Duncan, may I add to that response?
Sure.
This is Karen. So of the 2.5 million shortfall, the amount that is coming from the tax revenue, the shortfall is 1.28 million. And in the spirit of the equal sharing in the past, it has been equally sharing it. So the share is closer to the 500 number. The 1.28, 50% is like 640,000. So the remaining increases are as a result of our mandated increases. The remaining shortfall is coming from that. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay. All right. Well, as I say, in October, when we're all here, hopefully we're all here, the situation will look different. If it's worse than it is now, then I gather that, there'll be some very, very tough discussions about how to make up for the gap on the school side. And given what you said about personnel and the numbers, that probably has to do with positions and freezing and, impacts on salaries and so forth. So I want some level of expectation that is a possibility now, even though we hope it won't happen. The only other thing I would say is just in Mr. Shields, your memo, there's a reference on page 5, I think, to parking meter fees. And unless you've installed parking meters that I don't know about, I don't think we get any parking meter fees. But I'm not sure where that came from, but that is not a city revenue stream now, although maybe it should be. At any rate, just a little thing that I caught in your otherwise very fine statement, unless there's something that I don't know about. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Other folks who'd like to make a comment or have questions regarding the budget?
I do, Mr. Mayor. This is Ms. Connolly.
Hi, Vice Mayor Connolly. Go ahead.
Hi. So thank you for that. And as Mr. Duncan said, this is not a budget that any of us like or the budget that any of us expected. So thank you for your efforts to make it be a budget that we can at least pass for now and revise as the year goes along. So a few questions. Mr. Shields, the reimbursements that we'll get because of the COVID-19 emergency, the federal money that's going through the state, are school expenses included in that amount? Expenses at the school, or is it just general government expenses?
In terms of our direct response,
Right.
I will tell you what we're tallying up are from the general government, and I think the schools will get reimbursed through a separate mechanism.
Okay.
But I will confirm that. That's I appreciate that question. Then second, which is not your direct question, but in terms of the disbursement of the CARES funds that have gone through the Commonwealth of Virginia, there is a separate allocation for schools with respect to other localities. So there is a different route for the CARES funding to be routed to schools than for general government. But in terms of including the school's direct costs and our submittals, Ms. Bawa, do you know the answer to that? Because I have to say they're definitely not in our numbers yet, I'm pretty sure.
That's correct. They are not in our reimbursements, and they are pursuing separate, but I can find more answer to that and get back to council on that.
Thank you.
But we do expect that they'll be reimbursed somehow, if not part of this reimbursement, a different reimbursement.
That's correct.
Okay. Do we have an update on the stormwater / Washington and OD trail? This isn't actually, well, it sort of is a budget question. Last week we talked about the W&OD having its renovation and the plans and what was the stormwater, and we were going to get more information. Do you have any update on that this week?
We do. Thank you for the question. So we had an internal staff meeting on this topic, and then today we had a meeting with the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority just to make sure that we're all sharing the same information. We have been coordinating through this project. As I noted, the city has put on the table an alternative design that would not require a crossing of Trammell Branch to the north side of the WNOD. The Park Authority is evaluating that option, and we're in discussions about their preference of that routing versus the crossing. But we'll be able to make a decision on that, we think, fairly soon.
And are the neighbors updated on this?
No, because these discussions were just today. We've not gotten a letter back to the neighbors on that, but we will do so.
Okay, thank you. I do appreciate the fact that you had to make cuts somewhere. It is unfortunate that it's neighborhood traffic calming and walkability that has been cut. But I do think as you look at all of it, something has to give, and it's really hard to figure out what that something is. So I do appreciate that we're expecting that we will be able to revise this budget as the year goes on. And I'm wondering if you'll be able to provide us with a list of the first in things that we're going to add back in if we realize that there is more money available.
Thank you for that question. We have not prepared that, but we certainly can do that, and that, the council ultimately needs to be the deciders of that, so we can bring that for council's discussion.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question is just about, and you sort of answered this with Ms. Wilson's comment earlier this evening, but I've had a couple people ask, what about the fund balance? Why aren't we dipping into the fund balance to help us through this? And you always have a much better answer to that than I do. But what is the reason why we are not dipping into fund balance at this point?
So I'll give two answers. One, as is always the case, anytime you use fund balance, your next budget, you've got to figure out how to cover the operating costs that you're now covering with non-recurring revenue. But second, where we're able to make prudent spending reductions, we should do so through the budget process. And the use of unassigned fund balance should be retained for those circumstances where we're not able to react quickly enough because of a rapidly developing situation. Now, you could say this obviously is rapidly developing, and we are planning to cover FY20 shortfalls through a really sort of a quick constriction of spending. But we don't have any data yet. We don't know how steep the revenue fall off is going to be. And so it may be that when we come to you with reports in July that we will have not balanced. We didn't cut spending enough in FY20. And so that's an instance where we will use unassigned fund balance because we had to. We just didn't have time enough to react to it. In this budget, as noted, we're going with the moderate revenue reduction scenario amongst the range that were modeled. If it falls off more steeply, then we will continue to make reductions, but there may be some emergencies that happen in the current fiscal year. So I think the message is, let's not adopt a budget where we're solving it with fund balance, because it may happen, as this unfolds.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
All right. Thank you, Vice Mayor Connolly. Are there other folks who would like to ask some questions or make some comments about the budget? Mr. Z or Mr. Snyder, do you have any comments?
I do, but I'll defer to Mr. Z if he'd like to go.
I do have a whole plethora of questions or comments, but I think that we're probably in a good spot right now with regard to moving ahead with the budget. And we do have some touch points in the summertime, so we'll just have to see how it goes. It's uncharted territory for the entire United States. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Snyder?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks to all who's worked very, very hard on this budget so far, and thanks to the council members who will be working through this over the next month and this whole crisis over the next number of months. I want to make a couple first general comments. This is truly a urgent, drastic emergency budget we're talking about here, and for that reason I'm prepared to support moving forward on it. I'm not the least bit happy with a lot of elements of it. I think other council members have expressed those concerns as well. I'm concerned particularly about the neighborhood traffic calming and the stormwater issues, and hopefully we'll find ways to do more, but it is important that we are trying to move forward in those two areas. Second point I want to make is that everybody is called upon to make sacrifices in this environment. One of the things that I'm doing is foregoing my city council salary for at least 2 months because I want to make it clear that I'm not immune from this, nor frankly is anybody else. The next point I want to make is that you will hear me be a constant questioner about how and when we can prudently begin to not only begin, but actually return our economy to a workable, sustainable condition. It is not in that condition now. The longer this goes on, the worse it's going to get. The more difficulty this city is going to be in to maintain even core services and to maintain reasonable tax rate in comparison with other jurisdictions. So this issue is imminently linked with how we rapidly and prudently, consistent with reasonable public health elements, can move forward to restore this economy. This economy is not going to be restored by the federal government printing money and writing checks. This economy will only be restored when businesses can fully reopen and can bring their customers back, and the customers then are protected as absolutely necessary. Maybe not as some purists would like, but as absolutely and reasonably necessary to protect their health and safety. So I wanted to go through those issues, more general issues. Next, the issue of Metro has come up. Every budget session it comes up. We advocate, Cindy Mester and I work very hard to drive down the costs. They are lower than they were originally proposed. So if the council wants to develop a position on Metro funding, I will do everything to advocate that position. So we can mark that down as something for further work. And you bet I'll do everything I can to aggressively advocate whatever the council wants in that area. So those are the few comments that I want to make tonight. I'm dissatisfied with a lot of this. This is not a budget that I prefer. It's not a budget that I like. It's a budget that we have to move forward on in some form. And I believe that this form is and acceptable under the circumstances with the hope that things will improve. But I want to send this message very, very clearly. We're not going to be in a sustainable financial position in this city until we find a way, again, prudently, consistent with reasonable public health direction, to move forward, to recreate the kind of economy that's sustainable over the long term. And that is not where we are today. So with that, I'll just say that I'm prepared to vote for this budget tonight, to begin the discussion, to receive public input, but it is in an environment where the reestablishment, the reopening of our business community is absolutely fundamental to this city's future. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Are there other comments or questions from council members that have occurred since maybe you spoke a few minutes ago? Madam Clerk, are there any additional comments from the public?
Not at this time.
Okay. Maybe you could read that email one more time just so we can ensure that anyone who might want to participate can.
Yes, if anybody would like to participate, they can send an email to cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Shields, there are also going to be a number of other opportunities for the public to comment. I think you alluded to several of them at the back of your presentation. And I know we're going to try to make sure the public has as many opportunities as possible. That could be a virtual town hall on the budget and other things that we'll try to put together over the coming weeks. This is just the first step, as the first readings are on a budget, and so there's plenty of time for folks to give us their comments either through a meeting like this or individually through emails or other means. And this budget certainly is subject to change. I know there's a lot of folks who have a lot of issues with different parts of it. I do think, though, we are in a very difficult time right now, and that time calls for difficult choices to be made. And so my hope is that in the coming weeks, there'll be more clarity on assistance we might receive. I think in the next several weeks, the federal government, in fact, may consider additional aid to local governments. And I think that could make a big difference in how our budgets look, both for this year and next year. But as of the present, that assistance is very, very limited. So I do thank all those who have participated, including our school friends, for the good work they've done. And I do think that given where we are today, this is a good starting point. So I will support it as well. And unless there are any other comments, I will ask if there's a motion.
Mr. Mayor, unless others are willing to move, I'm willing to move to grant first reading to TO 2005, schedule public hearings for May 11 and May 26, schedule second reading and final consideration for May 26th, and advertise the same according to law.
All right, do we have a second?
Second.
Is that Ms. Hardy?
Connolly.
Ms. Connolly. So Ms. Connolly on the second. So we have a motion and a second. Madam Clerk, will you call the vote, please?
Yes. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Mr. Lickenhouse?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
And Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Thank you, Council. Motion carries 7-0.
All right, will you call the next item?
Yes, the next item is also a first reading. It's TO 20-07, ordinance setting the rate of tax levy on real estate for tax year 2021 and on personal property, machinery and tools, and all other property segregated by law for local taxation in the city of Falls Church, Virginia for tax year 2020.
Thank you. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. This item has no changes to the current rates of tax levies on real estate or on personal property, but we do adopt this ordinance every year by law to set the rate. But again, there's no change to the rates to the current year.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from council? All right. Madam Clerk, is there anyone who made comment through electronic means?
I have no further comment now.
All right. Unless there's additional comment or question from council, do we have a motion?
Mr. Mayor, I move TO 20-07, ordinance setting the rate of tax levy on real estate for tax year 2021 and on personal property, machinery and tools, and all other property segregated by law for local taxation in the city of Falls Church, Virginia for tax year 2020.
All right, thank you. Do we have a second?
Can we add to the motion the setting of the public hearings so you can direct me to do those, to advertise the rate?
Absolutely.
There's a motion somewhere.
The motion includes that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, do we have a second?
Second.
Vice Mayor Connolly?
Yes.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Madam Clerk?
Ms. Conley,
Yes.
Mr. Duncan,
Yes.
Ms. Hardy,
Yes.
Mr. Lickenhouse,
Yes.
Mr. Snyder,
Yeah.
Mr. Z,
Yes.
Mayor Charter.
Yes.
Thank you, Council. Motion carries 7-0.
All right, let's move on to other business.
Yes, and we do have one public comment for one of the items on public business. Would you prefer that I wait? It's about the easement.
Why don't you just wait till we call that item, which I know is next, but
Okay.
why don't
And
you read the comment during our discussion of that item?
Okay, and that's the only other public comment that I've received this evening. So our first item on other business is resolution to, it's actually the first one, sorry. It's resolution to approve an easement for Dominion Energy Virginia to relocate an underground power line within the Big Chimneys Park. And that actually is what we have the comment on. So would you like me to read that? Oh, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes, you can read the comment,
Okay,
please.
sure. So this is from Keith Thurston of 1015 Birch Street. He said he is very concerned about the easement location and specific wording of the easement being granted for Big Chimneys Park to Dominion Power. These edges of the park are the only places that trees were preserved. The center of the park was nearly cleared of trees by the city. He requests that council table the item until the specific issues can be resolved and documented correctly. He would like to call your attention to the map attachment and the actual easement words in section 1.1 and section 4.0, which gives all rights to decide about trees and routes to Dominion. The easement is intended to be underground only, but wording gives them all overhead rights on trees as well. It does not address if a Dominion is to bore or trench the underground cable. Trenching in these locations will kill all of the trees. The difference is huge. And then he lays out the easement words in section 1.1 to lay, construct, operate, and maintain one or more lines of underground conduit and cables, including without limitation one or more lighting supports and lighting fixtures as grantee may from time to time determine, and all wires, conduits, cables, transformers, transformer enclosures, concrete pads, manholes, handholds, connection boxes, accessories, and appurtenances desirable in connection therewith. The width of said non-exclusive easement shall extend 15 feet in width across the lands of grantor. And he also lays out section 4, grantee shall have the right to keep the easement clear of all buildings, structures, trees, roots, undergrowth, and other obstructions which would interfere with its exercise of the rights granted hereunder, including, without limitation, the right to trim, top, retop, cut, and keep clear any trees or brush inside and outside the boundaries of the easement that may endanger the safe and proper operation of its facilities. All trees and limbs cut by the grantee shall remain the property of the grantor.
Nice work. Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Shields, who's going to speak to this issue?
Let me introduce it. We do have Mr. Whitfield on the in this meeting as well, and he can speak to it. And Ms. McCoskey is familiar with the easement as well. So just in terms of the basic facts, there is currently a power line that runs right through the middle of Big Chimneys Park. This was actually not known to us at the beginning of the construction. It was uncovered during construction, and it is now delaying the progress of the project. Dominion has agreed to relocate this power line to the edge of the property, and so that's the request that's before the City Council. They'll only do so under an easement. In terms of the language of the easement, Dominion is typically, since this is something that they currently enjoy, a power line that serves their, the needs. They are moving it at our request, and so very often they are not willing to make adjustments to their standard easements. The comments that were received are ones that We're always concerned about protecting our trees in the public right of way and of course in our parks. And so let me ask, when we got the letter, our project manager was consulted, but it was after hours. So I don't know if we got the detailed report that we can use to respond to the concerns that were expressed. But let me turn it over to Mr. Whitfield for him to add any information that he has relative to the concerns that were expressed by Mr. Thurston in his letter.
Certainly. So I did talk with Al Astorga, who's the project manager, and I also talked with Kate Reich, our arborist. And so according to both of them, the easement does allow them to come in. They will be trenching. According to our arborist, though, we work with Dominion constantly when we get into close proximity to trees and roots. And so these can be bored underneath any roots. If there are some smaller roots that need to be cut, they'll be pruned and cut accordingly. So we work with Dominion constantly on these type issues. We don't think there's going to be any issues. Once it's underground, don't believe there's going to be any tree trimming of a sort because everything will be underground. I don't think there's also going to be any transformers or anything else in the park itself.
All right, thank you. Let's open it up to questions and comments from council. Does anyone have any comments or questions? If not, I've got a few. So let me ask either you or the city attorney, what's the width of the easement?
15 feet.
And what is it, just for like a 12-inch conduit?
It is just to feed the light system within the park. I think there may be at least 2 or more conduits. They're typically 2 to 4 inches in diameter.
Yeah, it seems like it's a bit bigger than it needs to be. I mean, I don't know, my own experience with easements, this seems like this could be a 10-foot easement, not a 15-foot easement for starters. Is there any thought been given to try to make this a narrower easement?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I can say that I don't know that that was requested for this easement. I know that I think their usual one is 20 and they have reduced them to 15 as they did the ones at the West End. But I don't know. I mean, this came up late when it was discovered that the wire ran through the middle of the park and they're trying to move it. So I don't know whether that was specifically discussed. So the wires, they're right down the middle, and I guess you're going to put playground equipment or something on top of them, so you want to move them outside that area? Is that why the wires are being moved? We go ahead, Mike.
Yes, so they are being relocated towards Bowl America, so they will be adjacent to the property.
You're talking about just the property line? They're going to run up and down the property boundary?
Correct.
And are there trees, like mature trees, I can't recall, up and down that same strip?
There is a cluster of trees, yes.
And are they mature, like mature hardwoods? I can't remember what's there.
I don't know the difference between the trees, I'm sorry.
So, but could you pull it out another 10 feet away from the boundary to avoid the trees?
The trees are very close to the boundary.
No, I'm saying the easement.
Well, the easement.
In other words, instead of going down to the very far left or whatever side it is, pull out 10 feet or 15 feet to give a little more breadth to the roots. In other words, don't run the easement right down the property line, but actually pull it more towards the middle, but not underneath the equipment, but still not underneath the trees either.
I'm not sure. I wasn't privy to some of the design when that was going on. I don't know if this was only requested by Dominion or if we actually requested that. Gotcha.
I guess all I would just say is that I have done a fair amount of easements in my day, and there often is some flexibility from the utilities. They're not always easy to work with, but there often is flexibility. And I think I would hate to see trees lost at any time because of this. It may be that, in fact, there won't be. The arborist may be saying that, in fact, that's not an issue. I don't personally have much knowledge one way or the other. I guess I would suggest if you all could work together and maybe reach out to Mr. Thurston to hear his concerns directly. I think that would be helpful. I know VPAS plays a major role in our, outdoor life here in the city. And so I do give credence to their concern. And as someone who does this somewhat professionally, I do understand it as well. Would that be possible for Joe to be able to reach out to Mr. Thurston and maybe in conjunction with the arborist as well? You all have a discussion and see if you can address the concerns they've raised?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So maybe you could do that and through Mr. Shields, just report back to us the outcome of that conversation.
Okay.
Would that be all right? Does that work for you, Mr. Shields, as well?
It would. And I wonder if I could ask Carol, would it be, here's my request of council, is that if I could get authorization to proceed in the form presented or better to ensure the protection of the trees in the park. My question is if I could get that authorization and that would allow, one issue that we do have is that this issue right now is delaying the rest of the project. We've run out of the other things we can do while we're waiting to get this resolved, and we weren't able to bring it to council because it wasn't considered an emergency under the COVID crisis. But I think we are all very alive to these concerns that were raised, and if I could and I would report to the city council that they've been addressed to the satisfaction of the city arborist. My question is, would that be satisfactory assurance for the city council and still allow this to proceed tonight?
And if you chose to do that, I would suggest that in lines 61 and 62 of the staff report, which is the resolution, you would just add some language so that it would state that it will be an easement as described in this resolution and shown on the attached plat, or as it may be adjusted to be smaller or to preserve more trees, is hereby granted by the city. And then we can work from there with potentially Dominion and with Mr. Thurston to see if we can get something better, and we'll let council know before anything is signed.
Does that sound all right to folks on council?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Can
Before
I
I
ask
go,
a question before we vote, though?
yes.
My question is, how did we not know that there was an electrical line going down the middle of the park? Or when did we figure this out?
I can tell you that I think it was discovered, and Mike may know better than I, but I think it was discovered when they actually hit the line doing some work. The problem, as I understand it, was that, and this is just what's been reported to me, is that it was under the name of Virginia. It's a very old easement, and it's under the name of Virginia Electric Power Company, and everyone was looking for the name Dominion, and so they did not find the easement originally.
So we didn't have to call Miss Utility to check it out? They just hit it?
I don't know
Okay.
what happened with that, Mike. I don't know whether you are aware.
Yeah, so they always do a misutility ticket on
Yeah.
these. This one, I'm not sure if it just got missed because obviously if there was a power line, they would not have hit it if it was marked. It did knock out the intersection at Annandale and South Maple when they did hit that line.
Okay.
All right, Madam Clerk, did we get any public comment on this matter?
Let's see. Other than Mr. Thurston's original comment, no.
Is there any other comment or question about this, or do we have a motion? Would anyone like to make a motion?
Mr. Mayor, I move to adopt TR 20-15 with the addition at line 61 that an easement as described in this resolution and shown on the attached plat, or as may be adjusted to be smaller or to preserve more trees is hereby granted, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, we have a motion, we have a second.
Second.
All right, Vice Mayor Connolly on the second, and I would just ask the city attorney to get involved with the language as well and try to make this as restrictive as far as the utility goes as possible.
I will do that. It may be difficult. I think it is clearly an underground easement, but I can discuss that with Mr. Thurston too.
All right, Madam Clerk, will you call the vote, please?
Yes. Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Mr. Lickenhouse?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yeah.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0. Thank you, Council.
Thank you. Will you call the next item, please?
Yes, our final item is authorization for the city manager to award a contract to Brown, Edwards and Company LLP for audit services for 5 years with 2 optional years in an amount not to exceed $585,000.
Mr. Shields?
Ms. Bawa, would you like to present this item?
Sure thing. Good evening, Mayor Tarter, members of the council. This item requests approval of contract to Brown, Edwards and Company to perform audit services of the city's financial processes and statements. The audit covers all city's funds, including the school board funds and the Economic Development Authority and the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Training Academy. The terms of the contract is 5 years. Annual cost is roughly $100,000, along with the $75,000 in contingency funds. The not to exceed amount for this contract would be $585,000, with the city's portion being roughly 70% of that. The remaining 30% is comes from the school board and the Northern Virginia Criminal Justice Academy. With that, I conclude my report.
All right. Questions or comments from Ms. Bawa or Mr. Shields? Anyone have any questions?
I do, Mr. Mayor. We're committing to this contract. Is it the result of a competitive process, number one? And number two, are we committing to pay it up front or we pay in yearly installments?
So yes, the answer to your first part is yes, it was a competitive bid process. We had 5 responses. We narrowed down to 2. And Brown and Edwards came as, for the cost was the last criteria, and theirs was the ideal proposal. So we are going ahead with them. And yes, so we pay on an annual basis, subject to appropriations. I should mention here, we do not pay for the whole 5 years up front.
Yeah, in the context of our budget situation, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? So I'll ask one. That seems like a long time, 7 years.
I have one question too when you're done.
Go ahead, you can go first.
I just couldn't get off mute fast enough.
Sorry, you go ahead and go.
We've had the contract with Brown and Edwards for a while now. Is there any concern that because we've had the contract with them for so long that we should switch to someone else?
Well, I mean, we are doing our due diligence to see who the viable and candidates are out there, companies, and we did get a good response with 5 bids. The proposals were rated. We had also the CFO from the school side on the evaluation committee, and there were 2 clear top candidates, and then the final decision was based on the pricing. So, I mean, concern on somebody being your auditor for that many years, it's good to have your financial processes and statements evaluated with different. I personally do not feel it's always the best option to stick to the same auditors. However, we've done our best and we'll be going out for bid within the next 5 years.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? It seems to me 7 years seems like a heck of a long time for one contract. What is the advantage of doing a contract for starting with 5 years at least?
So the contract is for 5 years, Mayor, and there are 2 optional years for extension if we choose to go there.
I saw that. I'm just saying, what are the advantages of that? That seems like a long time. I mean, like as a lawyer, nobody hires me for the next 5 years. Usually it's shorter periods of time. Why are we hiring an auditor for the next 5 years?
Industry practice is 3 to 5 years. So we chose to go with the higher end of the spectrum. We will be mindful the next time around. Our financial services advisor contract is also 5 years. So just for consistency's sake, we've done a 5-year RFP.
Okay, well, let me also ask you, is this a fixed fee for each year, or is it, vary? Hey, City Council asked 1 million questions, or we're now on the hourly clock. What's the basis of the cost each year? Is it just a set fee, or can it increase? Are there ways for them to get more funds? How does it work?
It is a set fee, although they do define certain a ballpark of number of hours for different hierarchy of people involved in doing it. But it is a set fee for year 1, and then built after that is this CPI. Consumer price.
So in past years, have they actually stuck to that? So the year is supposed to be, $100,000 or whatever it's supposed to be, and we don't come back with a bill for extras. Hey, I sat through that really long city council meeting. It was torture. Here's another, $5,000 bill or whatever. They've actually in the past come back on essentially what their fixed fees are supposed to be each year.
That's correct. We've been within their bid for the last 10 years that we've been with them.
Okay.
And we've not had to use the contingency funds either.
Okay. All right, Mr. Lichtenhouse has a question. Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yeah, sorry about that, Mr. Mayor. Do we have a termination provision in between years? Like an option not to take on a subsequent year?
The usual termination clause that we have in our contract.
Which is what?
Well, I think it's the usual mutually agreeable.
I think we usually do have a termination for convenience clause. We would have to pay them for work that's been done, but and I'd have to look at this one specifically, but generally we have termination for convenience.
Okay. I'd like to confirm that. I just have reservations committing to a 5-year contract. I mean, I'm familiar with these types of contracts, 5-year with an escalation at CPI, but there's typically right on the government's behalf, on city's behalf, to be able to terminate for convenience. And of course, paying for any work that's done. And normally, I wouldn't be as concerned about it, but as many of us are well aware, we're going into a period of what could be some significant financial concern and constraints. And so I'd like to have that flexibility in working with some type of financial advisor in CPA. And if we find the need to seek out a different expertise, I'd like to have that ability. So if someone can't tell me 100% that we have that ability to terminate in between years, I'm not going to be in support of it.
Okay, well, I'll just need to verify with the purchasing agent, but my understanding is that we always have that in our standard contract terms.
Okay. Well, I'll abstain from this vote then, if we're not 100% sure.
Are there other comments or questions? I mean, I hear what Mr. Lichtenhouse is saying, and I have that same, you might have inferred from my question about how long this thing goes on for, which seems like an awful long time, that I also would like some more flexibility along the way. I don't know whether we can authorize it subject to that provision being in there. And I'm speaking to the city manager or the city attorney. In other words, we approve authorization of a contract, blah, 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 so long as it includes a termination for convenience clause, the city's behalf.
I think you could put that in there. The only question would be, I mean, yes, I think you can put that in there. And
Okay.
if in the event, for some reason, discussions on this particular contract had not included that language, staff would need to come back to you for authorization for the contract.
All right. Do other people have thoughts on this issue or in general on this matter?
I do. It's Dan Z.
Yeah.
I'm not really worried about having a contractor on board with us for such a long period of time. And I think that 3 to 5 years is perfectly reasonable. We may or may not choose to enact the two options. I mean, it needs to be said, the obvious benefit to having someone here is that you're not going to have to pay someone else to understand and absorb all the things that they look at in the city. So we're going to have behind the scenes cost effectiveness, cost efficiency. And also my second comment would be that I find it would be remarkable if this did not have the standard provisos for termination for convenience. So I've never seen a contract written without that. So it would surprise me greatly, given our highly professional staff, that they would look for these things and they would pick these things out. They may not remember at this moment. Like I said, lots of things are waiting for us to do. And for this one, I think to say, well, maybe we just end it in a couple of years and just ask for new proposals is not really a good use of our time and money for staff. They're going to have plenty to do. So I would propose that we move to adopt TR 20-15. Is that right? No.
It's actually the one below that. Sorry. We didn't scroll down far enough.
Yeah. All right. I move to authorize the city manager to award a contract to Brown Edwards Company, LLP, for audit services 5 years with 2 option years, an annual amount not to exceed $585,000, subject to annual appropriations. Thank you.
All right. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. So we have a motion and a second. Do we have comment on the idea of requiring a termination for convenience clause? And that would allow the city to basically terminate the contract at its own unilateral decision. So it wouldn't require anyone to terminate the contract. It would just give the right or ability for the city to terminate and then pay for any work that's been done to that point. Does anyone have any other comment? We've heard from a couple folks now, but not everyone. Does anyone have a thought on their preference?
Mr. Mayor, this is Kieran. May I just looked through the details of the RFP, and it includes language on termination pending funding and termination pending performance. So it does include that clause on termination of contract on the city side.
Great.
Is that termination for convenience or termination for cause? It sounded like when you said performance, that sounded like for cause. Does the city attorney have anything to weigh in on that?
Their performance is for cause.
I have not seen it sounds like what she's mentioning. First of all, if you didn't appropriate funds in any given year, it would terminate. I don't know, it doesn't sound like those are convenience, but it just may be in our general conditions. I believe it is. So I just don't want to say without having seen it, and I haven't seen this contract.
I'd like to amend my a motion to include, provided that the contract includes a termination for convenience clause.
All right, we have an amended motion. Do we have a second on the amended motion?
Second.
Mr. Lichtenhouse on the amendment, on the second. Thank you, and thank you for the amendment, Mr. Z. Any additional comment? Any public comment, Madam Clerk?
No, sir.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and call the vote then?
So I'm calling the vote first on the amended motion.
I think that's the only motion.
Yes.
We weren't voting to amend the motion, and
Well,
Ms.
I think
Clerk,
looking at Carol.
I think Mr. Z had the consent of the vice mayor. Maybe that didn't happen, to amend the motion. But I don't think we have to vote on the amended motion but I would defer to the city attorney.
Mr. Mayor, this is Kieran again. Sorry, may I confirm now that the contract would include termination for convenience, termination for cause, termination due to unavailability of funds in succeeding fiscal years. All those three are included as part of the contract.
All right. All right, well, we still have a motion which may be redundant, but it's still on the table. And if those things are already included, then it may be that it's already met those conditions. But it may be that the motion that's on the table does no harm, since it sounds like it's addressed on your quick reading of it. City attorney, I just ask her, do we have to change this motion in any way, or we can just go ahead and vote on it?
Well, normally you would need to vote to amend the motion. So it might be useful at this point, now that we know that the termination for convenience is in there, just to go back to the original motion.
This battle will be between chickens.
What's that? Was someone speaking? All right. I'll leave it to Mr. Z. It was your motion and your amendment. Are you okay with the original motion, given what Ms. Bawa said? Or do you want to continue on with your amended motion?
I would prefer to continue on with my amended motion.
All right, then council should first vote on whether to have the amendment. And then another vote would take place regarding approving or not the amended motion.
Whoa.
So can't the maker of the motion, with the consent of the seconder, amend his own motion without a vote of council?
Well, I'm sorry, who made the motion initially?
Mr. Z.
Oh, okay, and he's just amending it?
Yes.
Well, if you get a second for that, you can probably leave the first one off the table. Yes, I apologize.
Vice Mayor?
Well, I was the seconder. I'm just wondering what the point is of having it in there if it's already in there. Nope, just belt and suspenders?
I don't know that's in there.
I think it is. Ms. Bawa says she went back and looked at it and did find that it had termination for cause, termination for convenience, and the termination for the non-availability of funding.
Okay. So if it's in there, I'm happy to vote to have the amended motion. I'll second that. And we'll just say it's belt and suspenders.
All right, so did you just second his amended motion?
I did, yes, I did.
Okay, is there any further comment? Or let's just go ahead and take a vote. Maybe hopefully get this taken care of. Anyone else have any additional comment, or should we go ahead and move to a vote?
We're voting on the amended motion now, right?
Correct. Okay, Madam Clerk?
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Hardy?
Yes.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yep.
Mr. Snyder?
Yeah.
Mr. Z?
Oh, certainly yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
That motion carries 7-0.
All right, thank you all. So now let's move on to the city manager's report. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor. Members of council, there are two things I wanted to report on tonight. One is our work regionally on the advanced planning for reopening our business community and our economy, as well as our city facilities. But before I report on that, Mr. Whitfield has prepared a slideshow to talk about some of the projects, just to provide council with an update on some of the projects that are advancing around the city. And so before we talk about that, the reopening process, if we could first turn it to Mr. Whitfield to go through that presentation.
All right. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Council. So I do have a little bit of a presentation. Try not to take up too much time, but this is something that I'd like to go through, and it's going to cover some facilities, some transportation projects, parks projects, some utilities. And most of this is going to be things that are under construction or completed, or a couple of them which are in design. So next picture, please, or slide. So as you can see, this is going to be a very brief agenda. So next slide, please. I'll start out with City Hall. So City Hall, we've got several things that are still ongoing, one of those being the chambers modification. So we're waiting on a quote right now for assisted listening systems. That should be completed in May of this year. Also, we have some ITS and security issues, or things that need to be completed. So we do have those coming up. Those should be completed in the summer of 20. And then the next item in City Hall is going to be the clerk of the courts. So we do have some cost, and we have these upcoming, and so this work should be completed somewhere around July of 20. And so that's it for City Hall. The next one is the library.
Hey, can I just note on all those City Hall items, those have all been within funds that are already appropriated by City Council. So there'll be no budget requests with any of those final change-outs.
All right. So library, as you can see, it is on its way. Demolition is about 80% complete. Next slide, please. And so the site work and excavation should be done within the next 3 to 4 weeks. And on the interior, we've got quite a bit. Next slide, please. So the interior demo, this is the basement. It's fairly well gutted. Next slide. As well as the upper level, which is already been gutted. And so the next step is going to be the proposed openings and the wall sections, which will be removed. Okay. Next slide, please. And so that's it on the facility side. And then what we'll do is we'll jump into some transportation projects. This is Northwest Street and Oak Street. These were pedestrian improvements. And so we've got these completed. We say completed 99%. We still have punch list items to complete. And so a few of these I do not have slides, and I apologize, but we'll kind of go through these briefly. We had some traffic signal timing. It's 99% complete. This is all for the corridors of Broad and also Washington. And we also have some ongoing work on a smart scale project, which is the Broad Street hawk signals. So today they're 100% designed, and they've been submitted to VDOT, and we're just waiting for final approval on those. Okay, next slide, please. So the next one is an NTC project, which is Annandale and Gundry. I don't know if everyone has seen this one yet, but this one really turned out very nice. So it's 95% complete. Again, we still have some punch list items to take care of. So that one was completed by Espina Paving, who is our NTC contractor. Another project that we've got going is Great Falls and Northwest Street. This is an intersection improvement. We are doing this jointly with Fairfax County. I apologize, I didn't have any slides. They haven't done a lot of work out there yet, but it is underway right now, and they haven't completed too much of the project at this point. And a couple other design projects, if I can mention those, is North Washington and Columbia intersection. So this is another intersection improvement project. And so that one is underway. Right now we're looking at right-of-way, and we're in negotiations with right-of-way with adjacent owners. And one more project that we've got that's in design, which is part of the CIP, is South Washington and Annandale. We have just started this one, and so so far we began some preliminary design on that, and it's on schedule right now. Next slide, please. So we do have some other crosswalks I wanted to mention as well. So Jackson and Timber, and South Spring and Poplar, which is the next slide. And then also Columbia and Van Buren, which is slide number 12. So those are all about 99% complete. Again, we have some miscellaneous punch list items. Had no change orders. Again, this was a Spina paving. Next slide is our annual paving program. So the annual paving program, we did quite a bit this year. We did Villa Ridge, so we did complete the entire section of that roadway. Next slide is Greenwich, which is from northwest to Lincoln. So we paved that one as well. And then the one that we have not done yet, and I think it was supposed to start today, is Great Falls. So haven't checked in with that one, but it was supposed to commence this today. So that was it for some of the annual paving. The next one, next slide, is going to be the primary extensions. And so the primary extensions we did this year is Hillwood Avenue. So we paved the entire corridor on Hillwood Avenue. We did leave out the section down by South Washington, because that will become part of the South Washington Intermodal project. And so that one is, we're calling it 90% complete. We do have some punch list items on that as well. So as soon as we get those completed, we'll close the project out. So those have gone very well. So we had no change orders on those either. One we don't have a slide on, but it's, I would like to mention this one. This is Railroad Avenue and Ellison Street. So this is a stormwater project. We just recently completed the reconstruction of Railroad Avenue. And in conjunction with that will be another project coming up, which is going to be improvements for the stormwater out there. Next slide, please. So we did, in addition to paving and some other crosswalks this year, we did some signal upgrades. And so some of the signal upgrades that we did, as you can see, are pedestrian features. So we did Lincoln and Great Falls, which is the one that you're looking at here on the slide. And then the next slide, please. We did Broad and Little Falls. So we did additional pedestrian features as well. This one was a complete cabinet replacement for the signal. And so this is another great candidate. So Ms. Hardy, if you have some artwork you'd like to put on this nice shiny cabinet, now's the time to do this one. It's in a very high visible place. And one of the others that we did was at Broad in Virginia. So we put another signal cabinet in there as well. So that one's brand new. And then some of the other minor things that we did are we put a lot of battery backups into our signals at Broad and Lee and West and Lincoln as well. Next slide, please. So I want to move on to some of our sanitary sewer or utility projects. And so this one is the West End Sanitary Sewer. You can see from the slide there that they're almost complete with this. We do have it down to one lane during the day when they're under construction. And so they're on the last piece of this particular one. And so that one should be done by the end of May. So we're looking at perhaps another 30 days and this will be complete. Next slide, please. And so the other one that we're working on is Mustang Alley. And so this is another sanitary sewer project. It has already been constructed all the way up to where Mustang Alley is along Shreve Road, or I'm sorry, Haycock. I always get those backwards. On Haycock Road. And so all we have to do is the crossing, and they've got most of the installation done. This is where these construction workers are standing. That is about 20 feet deep in that area. So it's a very deep system. This one also will be completed by the end of May. So within the next 30 days, we should see both of these projects wrapping up. And I would like to note that during Mr. Shields' presentation earlier, that he had mentioned that we have a field engineer that we are just put on board. He starts May the 4th. That person will be taking over these projects, as well as some of these other CIP projects. So we'll be glad to have someone in-house on board, and we can actually not use so many CEI firms. Next slide, please. So I don't have any more pictures, but I do have a few more projects I would like to mention, though. So a couple of those are stormwater projects. One of those is Wrens Branch, and Wrens Branch right now we do have a new plan for Wrens Branch, and it is making some improvements. And I had mentioned previously that I had talked with our operations division about perhaps doing some of these. And so some of these projects that we're going to be able to do, if we can actually make some improvements to residents, whether it's reconstructing a driveway, if we have to, we'll reconstruct inlets, we'll make throats bigger. If we can improve some of the flooding, that would be the case in this particular Wrens Branch. We do have a resident that floods constantly. And so this project was moving forward. We've got a design. We've not met with the homeowner lately because of the virus. And so as soon as we can, we'll sit down with them. If we can't, then we'll interact the best we can so that we can present the plan to that homeowner. And then the other one that I had previously mentioned too was Railroad Avenue and Ellison Street. So we're short one easement. As soon as we get the easement from the property owner, then we'll complete that project, and that will be another stormwater improvement. It's very minor work, but it's going to make a major impact for that area, especially on Ellison Street. And with that, I've only got two other little comments. I think we've talked about Big Chimney Park and what happened out there with Dominion. We've had some other things going on with Fairfax Water and Washington Gas. So we've had a lot of utility conflicts and issues. So for instance, Washington Gas, we have to relocate one of their gas mains in association with the stormwater. Washington Gas needs to go into residents to check pilot lights. They're saying right now they will not enter anyone's home. So that has been delayed until sometime around the end of July. It will not hold up Big Chimneys Park. So I've directed Alice Storga, our project manager, to go ahead and complete the park project the best that we can, continue with it. As we install the stormwater, we'll just cover it up and we won't utilize it. It will not go active until we get the project and the gas main itself relocated. So that was one of the things that we've run into. The other one I mentioned previously is when they hit the electric line that put the intersection at Annandale and South Maple out. So we found ways around this. This intersection will be dark for about 2 to 4 weeks. And so our solution for that is we found a generator that we are renting. We looked at using some of our own generators. It would have probably killed the life of at least 2 of our generators, and so we didn't think that was very cost effective. It's only going to be about $600 a month to rent this generator. So we will keep the intersection powered. We just have to put diesel fuel in it every 2 or 3 days. So it's a small consolation, but we will get this thing completed. And the other minor project that we're working on, it really hasn't started yet, is the Fellows property. So the Fellows property, we do have the silt fence up. We've got it scheduled to demo. They should be in perhaps this week, if depending on the weather. If not, then it will be next week. It's only going to take 3 to 4 days to actually demo the structure and fill in the basement, and that project will be very close to being complete by that time. So that, I didn't want to take up a whole lot of your time. This is just a brief update of some of the good work that's been going on here in the city.
All right, thank you very much. Are there any quick questions for Mr. Whitfield? Thank you for that presentation, all the good work you're doing. Are there any questions for Mr. Whitfield before we move back to Mr. Shields' presentation?
Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. We should have started with the good news first, because this is all really good to see progress on all these fronts. And I think especially all the projects on the ground, they're more visible than ever with everyone being on the streets. I've gotten pretty much all those intersections you mentioned. People text me photos of them, of their kids biking on them or using them with all their pedestrians. So people are really enjoying them. So please pass on our thanks to the crews, especially the ones who can't work from home and can't observe all the distancing protocol that we're asking. We know that they're putting their health at risk for this. 2 comments and then a quick question as well. On Columbia and Van Buren, I think we'd previously gotten communication from residents at that corner that there were some visibility issues with adding that crosswalk. Did that get resolved with the new design now?
I think it did. There was a visibility problem with some, I think it was some shrubbery there. And Zach...
Shrubs and parked cars, or where cars are parked. I don't remember the details, but I just want to make sure we had followed back up and we haven't heard complaints since that was done.
Right. So I think we have taken care of that.
Okay, great. And then the same on Hillwood. I think we've also gotten email traffic about people concerned about parking outside their home. Did we resolve that as best we could, or where does that stand?
Yes, we did. So Zach Bradley actually met on site with the 2 residents. I think Mr. Shields actually joined him with one of those. And so one of the problems that we have when we repave, and we are now required to upgrade pedestrian and ADA features. And in conjunction with that is striping. And so we have to have striping either side of a handicap ramp. And so that does take up parking spaces. But this is a federal law. This is not a state or city code.
Well, Hillwood's turned into one of my running routes with the WOD being crowded, and I actually think the bike lane and the dedicated parking lane actually are great places for people to dump onto when the sidewalk gets crowded, and it's worked out really well. It's a good stretch for people. So related to the budget, Wyatt, with the cuts that are being proposed, should we expect that we'll see less of these projects happen in FY21?
Well, with the projects that Mike just went through, I think it underscores how much of our CIP is funded through grants and through through state and federal dollars. And so those projects will still continue on with them. That's one of the reasons we wanted to delay the CIP to May 26th, is because we just want to confirm those funding streams. I think every public agency in the country is sort of reevaluating and adjusting things, so we wanted to make sure we were on, take the extra 4 weeks to make sure that those funding streams are where we think they're going to be, because they fund so much of our CIP. So the beginning part of tonight's meeting was about cutting our locally tax-supported budget. The CIP is so largely grant-funded that it is still proceeding full tilt. And that position that Mike mentioned, the field engineer, that is we have a hard hiring freeze in effect. However, that position is one that we are filling because it will actually allow us to do that field engineer work more cost effectively than using the contracted services that we are currently relying on. So that'll help us, I think, continue with the project of these grant-funded CIP projects.
I think also say is that I think the walkability priority that council's had for the past several years is more important than ever, especially in times like this. Like, you see the number of pedestrians out and about, and so these real projects actually make big difference in everyone's lives right now. So thank you. If I could just end with one request, something I've seen other cities do, just as a general both pedestrian-friendly practice and just in a healthier way, is actually to program our pedestrian button to be automated. So rather than have people touch buttons with their hands, which might be germy, just have them programmed so they automatically go to walk. So I think with obviously more pedestrians out in our streets, I wonder whether we could consider that programming change, which would obviously be low cost and wouldn't require new infrastructure.
Certainly, I can talk with our engineering group. If I might also mention that I've been contacted several times by Terry Yates at VDOT. And he's the LAP program manager over there, and he wanted to make sure that the city had a contingency plan that we will continue all of these federal funded projects, and I told him that we do.
And Mr. Shields, if I could add, of course, the General Assembly just approved the revised transportation budget, and we're sorting through those details. This Wednesday, I'll be participating in a statewide meeting with Secretary of Transportation Valentine to confirm some of those impacts, because they have held some of the CTV projects for the next 6-year plan. So we will have updated information to also feed into the CIP, as you mentioned earlier. Another reason for the timing of the CIP ordinances.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Whitfield?
Yeah, just a quick question, Mr. Mayor, if you will. Just to clarify, so the hiring freezes that we're budgeting for 21, if we do get all of the state, federal money, all the grants that we're expecting, will we have enough staff to carry that out?
Currently, yes.
Okay, great. All right. Hey, Mike, thanks so much. This was a really bright spot in an otherwise kind of dismal few months here. So it's good to see you guys out and about making these investments for us. Thanks.
All right, you're welcome.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Whitfield?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. Second what Ross said. Thank you, Mike. Wanted just to get on the record with the correspondence from this week from one of our younger citizens about the condition of Madison Street, which drew a response from Wyatt that it would be looked into. And just wonder, Mike, if you know, as part of our regular inspection of streets and program of repaving, how likely is it that a street like Madison Street is in the queue, in the near future?
I do not know where it falls in the queue. I know that our paving programs, we do try to prioritize those, and I don't remember seeing that one on the list. Okay,
well, I think we said we would go take a look at it, so let's just go take a look at it and get back. It was a nice correspondence from the young citizen, including dad jokes, which the mayor got into banter with her about, quite entertaining. Thanks for the note on fellows. I appreciate that. You'll let me know when the demolition occurs. I'll try to observe it socially distantly. And back to what you said about Washington Gas on East Columbia, there is, I think, that situation with coming into people's basements to look at their meters or whatever. What are they doing on East Columbia? Are they just replacing everybody's meters, or the lines that feed out to the meters? What are they doing?
There's a lot of, they call it Virginia Save, it's service lines. And so they are doing a lot of that type of work throughout the city.
All right. Thanks very much.
Okay. All right. Anything else from Mr. Whitfield? All right. Mr. Whitfield, thank you so much for all the great work you're doing and for sticking around with us this evening.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Shields, do you want to go ahead and finish up?
Okay, thank you. So we've been working very hard over the last couple of weeks to try to understand the federal and state framework for reopening our economy. And so a couple of things I want to report on. Late last week on Thursday and Friday, the mayor of DC and the governor of Virginia and Maryland all announced their initial planning for reopening the economy. And so one positive thing, we've been pushing very hard that the three coordinate their planning. And so one positive thing to report is that they are coordinating. They are in regular contact with each other. And many of the things that they're saying are aligned. None of them have announced dates for when the current executive orders that have resulted in the closing of businesses will be lifted. And then, one other note, we are still working for there to be more communication between the state government and the local governments so that we can plan together. But I think that late last week was a step in the right direction for getting a bit more clarity than we had had before. I'll hit some of the key points of Governor Northam's blueprint for reopening. Some of the gateway criteria, which are the same as President Trump had announced and are the same as called for by the CDC. But the governor emphasized that key indicators will include a 14-day downward trend in confirmed cases as a percentage of overall tests. So that's an important distinction. It's not a downward trend in confirmed cases, because as testing ramps up, the number of cases likely will increase simply because of the improved testing capacity. And so the metric is confirmed cases as a percentage of overall tests. And then the other metric is a 14-day downward trend in COVID-19 hospitalizations. And so we're now tracking both of those metrics, so we have some insights into the same data that the governor's looking at. The other key elements that need to be in place is robust testing and contact tracing capacity. These are two areas where we have a lot of work to do to get stood up to the levels that the CDC and the governors themselves call for. Currently, as of last week, Virginia was testing between 2,000 and 3,000 people a day. We were in the bottom 10th of all the states in the Commonwealth in terms of our testing numbers. The governor's plan is to ramp up to 10,000 tests a day. He has not set a date for achieving that, but has indicated that that's what they're aiming to get to. They have appointed a testing task force that is headed by a former commissioner of health for the Commonwealth of Virginia that's spearheading that effort. And that's a public-private effort to expand testing. The contact tracing, what that means is that, and then I think this is particularly relevant when the testing numbers do go down, that when there is a positive case, that there's a process of identifying who that person has been in contact with so that they can be contacted and to quarantine. The whole effort is to focus on the positive cases and their contacts so that the entire economy doesn't have to be shut down, rather simply the people who are dealing with the illness directly or have tested positive directly. Personal protective equipment. This obviously has been a national problem, but standing up the levels of PPE for our medical community so that if there is a surge in cases when the economy opens up, our medical system is adequately equipped to handle it. And then the other metrics are that there's adequate capacity in our hospitals and amongst our hospital staff to deal with a surge in cases if that should happen after the easing of restrictions. So that's the governor's statements on that. Again, they're very similar to what Governor Hogan and Mayor Bowser have laid out. The governor has also created a business opening task force that will report back to him on the practical steps to comply with health department restrictions, but to do it in a way that the business community thinks that will actually function as they begin to open up. I think a couple of things we've been working on. We think that there will be a role for local governments to help with all these reopening efforts, to help our business community to do it successfully, and also to help possibly with municipal employees to help with the contact tracing or other elements of this opening. I think we're envisioning it as being a nationwide mobilization to help the economy open up in a manner that's safe, that doesn't spark a resurgence of cases. I think overall the objective is to avoid a situation where our medical system is overwhelmed and that hospitals have to operate at a crisis standard of care. That's what you've seen in pockets of the country, and notably in New York City, and I think that's what every health professional is trying to avoid. It's a very difficult thing to do because there's a 14-day to 20-day lag between changes in policy with respect to social distancing and the current restrictions, and when the cases start to appear. One way to think of it is a faucet that when you turn it, it takes 2 weeks before you see what the effect of that turn is in terms of the volume of water that comes out. And so the governor has signaled a lot of caution in terms of his plans to reopen the economy in Virginia. He's also stated that he expects the entire state to be on the same timeline. That's what he stated on Friday, although I think today he modified that somewhat and saying that there might be some differences in timelines in terms of different parts of the state. But more to come on that. We've been participating regionally. The city council has, staff has, to try to communicate with our state officials on the reopening process, as well as on the disbursement of state funds or federal funds that are running through the state government. The mayor mentioned that a little bit earlier in tonight's meeting. There isn't a lot of clarity on that or a very satisfactory resolution on the disbursement of funds. But one of our questions is, as the city, as well as other municipalities and counties, joins with the state to support this reopening process, how will reimbursement of our costs for that be handled by the state, particularly if it's a redeployment of staff that are currently budgeted for, but now they're being reassigned to help with COVID. Will we be reimbursed for that effort? And we'll get more guidance on that. So those are some of the highlights of some of the issues that we're working through. I think there's going to be this next phase is going to be one that will work very hard to make sure we manage it successfully for our economy and in the interest of public health. I'd be happy to answer any questions the council has or other comments that, the city council has been participating in this as well, and other insights that you'd want to share for the public as well.
All right, thank you, Mr. Shields. Are there comments or questions from members of council?
Well, Mr. Mayor, Dave Snyder, I do have a lot of questions. Let me run over a couple of these with Wyatt. So these criteria that you laid out, let me go through each one of them to determine where we are. The 14 days of reduced number of COVID cases versus testing. How far along on that 14 days are we, or have we not even started?
This past weekend was actually a tough weekend in terms of new cases, as well as hospitalizations, as well as deaths. So we are not at day one on any of those metrics.
Okay, so we're not on day one of that one. We're not on day one of the hospitalizations. But we are, let me ask you about healthcare facilities. As I understand it, the Northern Virginia hospitals have all indicated that they've got adequate equipment and adequate personnel. Is that right?
That is correct. And let me also just note with my prior response, I'm not going to be making these decisions. The governor will be. That's my best read of the data that has now been put onto the new data portals. So let me just clarify my response on that. But that's my read of it. And your characterization of the hospital status, that is the information that I have as well, that they are currently maintaining the caseload well, and they do have surge capacity today.
Right. So let me go back then. Will this decision be made based on the NCR part of Virginia or total Virginia? Or what I'm trying to figure out is these criteria, it seems to me, are very high to meet. And I'm just trying to figure out what they really mean. So what you're telling me is we're going to be locked down for at least 2 more weeks, even if we turned around today. Is that right under these criteria? So how long will this continue? 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year? Because these criteria, one could argue that they're reasonable, they're unreasonable, but okay, so they've been determined by the governor to be the way we're going to go. So how long, what do we need to do? Let me go into the contact tracing. How many more people do we have to employ to meet the contact tracing issue?
So for Fairfax County, they've estimated that they need 300 contact tracers to be stood up where they would want to be. And that's following a guideline of 100, at any rate, they need 300 contact tracers. I forget exactly what the multiplication is.
Do you have any idea what their average annual salary would be?
No.
Do we have that built into our budget at this point?
No.
No. Okay, all I'm doing is raising questions because we certainly want to do what's prudent, but who determines what's prudent is a very interesting issue, and what that is. So in generalization, it seems to me this is more like a formula for continuing the shutdown rather than a formula for opening up. So I'm just trying to figure out where we're going to be, because we've just gone over this very difficult budget process. So we're looking at being shut down for at least through mid-May, maybe longer. So I'm just trying to figure out, if these are the right criteria and how we're going to apply them, and what are the costs and what are the time for accomplishing them. That's number one. Number two, what we've uncovered a lot is vulnerable populations, minorities, those with comorbidities. Wouldn't it be better to start up the economy and focus on vulnerable populations rather than continuing to have the economy shut down, creating all kinds of issues very broadly, including the ability to afford some of these things? Wouldn't it?
I think you make good points. I think generally the goal is to get to focus more on the at-risk populations and those who've tested positive, as opposed to the blanket shutdowns that we're currently experiencing. I think that's the goal of where the public health policy is trying to get us to.
Okay, thanks for that. And so one other point. So I think the COG board and you, and I'm sure others, have basically appreciated and wanted to work in a regional fashion, DC, Maryland, Virginia. And yet the data is very different. Maryland is having a much worse situation with this than either DC or Virginia. Are we necessarily tied to how Maryland performs, or is the coordination an effort to coordinate, but Virginia, particularly Northern Virginia, may go its own way if our data justifies that?
What the governor has said is that he's going to try to be consistent statewide. He modified that somewhat today, and by noting, for instance, in the city of Bristol, on the opposite side of the Commonwealth, that the state line runs right down Main Street. So half of Bristol's in Tennessee and half is in Virginia. That was the example he noted where perfect consistency statewide doesn't make sense. In our pressing generally state policymakers about coordinating with Maryland and DC, it is really just related to the fact that our commuters cross the bridges every day, and that we are one big region. I think probably the rest of the state would like to be on a different timeline than Northern Virginia as well, because many parts of the state have lower case numbers than Northern Virginia does on a per capita basis, and certainly on a total basis. But so far, the governor's statements has been to try to be consistent statewide. I'm just relaying the information that we have.
So if we're doing better than Maryland in particular, or DC, you're not ruling out the possibility that we might do things a bit differently. In fact, we're already doing things differently than Maryland and DC.
Yeah, that is certainly true. And on Sunday, I sent out a side-by-side comparison of the key points from Hogan, Governor Hogan, Mayor Bowser, and Governor Northam. And there certainly are differences, and we should expect that. My earlier statement was, though, that the general principles that they've articulated are aligned with the CDC's guidance and with the White House's roadmap to reopening. They all are very consistent with each other.
Questions to you earlier were, what do those criteria really mean? And they don't mean any opening soon, is what they mean. Is that right? If those criteria stick and hold and are rigorously enforced, we're not talking about opening anytime soon. Is that right?
Yeah, what they often say when we try to get a date, they say, we're not talking about dates, we're talking about following the data.
Right.
That is that is the response that we get to that question.
Figure out what the data means and where are we with regard to the data. And what I'm hearing is that we haven't even begun these 14-day periods that are sacrosanct in the criteria that we're applying. Is that right?
That is my understanding of the data, but with that caveat, yes.
Okay, so one more thing. A number of our businesses have been really creative about staying in business, and this may be something that is best done almost business by business, sector by sector. For example, if you're one kind of business, you can find a way to stay open. If you're in another kind of business, it would be a different way. We see that all over the place. So I'm hoping that we can begin to address some of these things at the grassroots level, business by business, even if we're blocked from dealing with it in a large sort of context. And let me ask you how we're doing there in terms of the working with businesses, exchanging information about how they're able to stay open, continue to serve customers.
So that's a good question, and there is a lot of innovation that's happening out in our economy right now as people are figuring out how to provide services either virtually or with grab and go in a way that is keeping people safe. So as a positive statement, I will just say I think that I and just about everybody is impressed by how, one, responsible our local business community has been, and B, how creative and innovative they've been. But even with that creativity, there's no question that many of them are suffering great economic setbacks. So going forward, working with our business community on how to help them reopen, it is a priority for us, and we're trying to sort it out ourselves with the guidance that's available about how we can be of assistance in that. So I think we're still learning in that space as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks for my council colleagues for giving me this time. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Sure, absolutely. Are there other comments or questions for Mr. Shields?
Yeah, I got a question.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Yep, thank you. Wyatt, you may have touched on this, and I know we're talking about openings based on data. Based on my conversations, folks I've talked with, whether it's our regional organizations or folks working as first responders, conversations with the government, I think this was outlined in the documents that you have. They were considering, at least based on the trajectory of the data, that there would be a reopening regionally in May. Did I catch that correctly? And again, I know that's probably a big TBD with an asterisk next to it, but.
So right? here's what we know. We know that the governor's executive order 53, which enumerates the essential and non-essential businesses and lays out those which must be closed, that is set to expire on May 8th. The governor has not yet indicated that he will extend that date. He has said that he will not relax anything sooner than May 8th. Those are the statements that we have to date.
Okay. All right. I'm optimistic, at least, that get some sense of normalcy by Memorial Day, but obviously driven by data and the testing. So, all right, thanks for that report.
Other questions or comments from Mr. Shields?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your report, Wyatt. Yeah, I think you're right about Northam's tone today, and his briefing was different from the ones that I try to listen to it every day. And he definitely was talking about, regional sensitive openings, particularly down in Southwest. And he seems to be relying on, he said he was going to have a meeting after his briefing with his business council. That group sounds like it's either set up to help him devise a reopening plan, or to give him cover if the data are not showing that reopening seems prudent, to give him cover to say it's not time to reopen yet. So listen, all this stuff is way above our pay grade probably. I mean, what we tried to do is going to be acted on tomorrow night by the Economic Development Authority to try to provide microloans to some of our small businesses, and that's a good thing. In that vein, what you said about, what can we do locally? We have some tremendous expertise in the city and in several different areas, and it would be it behooves the city to establish a reputation as bringing forward those experts, like Vince Doherty, the dentist, who is a leader in the state and national dental circles, and has been asked to be involved in setting standards to give people confidence to return back to their basic medical appointments, not virus related stuff, but just go get a dental checkup. Northam spoke to that today too, when he encouraged parents to go get the kids in for their vaccines. Don't not go to the doctor because you're not comfortable with going into a medical environment at all. Somebody like Doherty, let's lift people like that up. And we got leadership and tremendous energy in the restaurant business. That's going to be critical. If Falls Church could establish a reputation by, the 1st of June as, the place where they've figured out how you can go, get a good meal and still be safe, that would help us. So, getting some of those people involved. At Kensington, one of the premier assisted living businesses they're now giving out more data at the state level about the elder care facilities. I don't actually know what the Kensington's numbers are, and I don't know anything at all about Sunrise. But again, Falls Church could travel on the expertise of businesses that we already have here, who have shown some, ability to weather this. That helps us recover. That helps us hopefully by October be in a better position than we feel like we are today. The only final thought is, testing at that pace of testing in a commonwealth of 8 million people, it would take about 2 years to test everybody. So let's say that we're not going to test everybody, but still, it's just an impossibly long time to think about. So if we're going to get something done on testing, that is going to, I think, have to be a Falls Church generated activity. There are communities around the country that have, and they tend to be communities like ours, fairly small, very affluent. Can we stand up a local testing regime that would have an objective to have everybody in the city of Falls Church who lives or works here tested, by pick a date, Thanksgiving. Are we capable as a community of doing that? And on tracing, everybody's busy, but if there are certain employees that we have who, whose place of work, the library or whatever is shut down, can we redeploy some of those folks to the contact tracing effort? Tracing to me is secondary to testing, but those two together, if we had an initiative in that area, it would once again and finally, make a name for the city as a place that's serious about doing real work to get us back up and going. Because right now, really all we have is the CDC 14-day guideline, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, the scientists think that that's a reasonable thing to have, and even the president has signed off on it. I don't know if he remembers he did or not, but that's out there, and we need to try to implement that as best we can. But anyway, try to think local about some of these things, and again, back to the beginning, the Economic Development Authority's action tomorrow night is at least the beginning of the Falls Church response to this, terrible global tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions or comments for Mr. Shields? All right. If not, are there any scheduling questions or general comments that haven't been made this evening that folks would like to say before we adjourn?
We talked about that possibility of a town hall for the budget. Do you think that that'll be in addition to the meetings that we've outlined in the deck, or something in addition?
I think so, but I don't know if there's been extensive discussions about it to date. Mr. Shields, that work for you?
Yeah, there have not been extensive discussions on how to have town halls in addition to the public hearings that have been set. So let's talk about that a little bit more, and we can come up with some ideas on how to make sure that the public is engaged in these tough budget decisions that we have to make.
Great.
All right, thank you. Any other comments or questions before we adjourn? All right. So why don't we go ahead and adjourn, and thank you all for coming out this evening, and we will see each other next week. Good luck, and everyone stay safe.